Hey y'all, this is Ebony Adedayo. I am a writer, a pastor, and the founder of the Kinky Curly Theological Collective.
And this is Steve Kimes, a pastor of the homeless, and feeling like I need to add more to my introduction because Ebony's got so much.
The list is long when you wear many hats. This is BGWG, Black Gal, White Guy. And we are a podcast that explores the intersection of social justice issues of our day in theology. Today, we are going to be talking about the housing crisis in America, referencing our two states. I'm in Minnesota and Steve is in Oregon. Before we get into the meat of our discussion, do you have any resources for us today, Steve?
I do. I have a resource. Here's the thing. This is one thing that really, it kind of bugs me. It bugs me when people say, and I know this must really bug you all the time too, but it really bugs me when people say that rock and roll started with Elvis. That you think about a lot, I'm sure. But still, that really irritates me because, of course, you know, Elvis introduced rock and roll to white audiences and all of that. But man, some of the best rock was before Elvis. In fact, rock goes back into the 40s. Elvis was a little baby when some of this stuff happens. And the other thing that really bugs me is people say that rock and roll is all about sex and all about rebellion and stuff. Rock and roll started in the church. The initial rock and roll started in the church, and and we just have to go back. And now that so many of us have access to huge music libraries, whether on Spotify or on YouTube or whatever, it is time to get us knowledgeable about some really great music that we've missed out. And so I want to recommend, my recommendation is that people check out 3 artists that are gospel-oriented and early rock musicians. One of them is Reverend Gary Davis. He's got some of the best sermons in music that I've ever heard. Just really amazing. Anyway, Reverend Gary Davis, Blind Willie Thornton, and now they're both blues musicians, but then one who's a little bit more gospel and is actually the person who I personally think that Jesus inspired to create rock and roll, which is Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I think that she is amazing, and she has got just she is the precursor to Janis Joplin and to a lot of the rock, a lot of the really rough rock artists. Big Mama Thornton, she's precursor to Big Mama Thornton. All of these rock artists that came up later that just have this really rough and tumble voice, and she sounds like she's fighting with something, fighting with the devil or something like that. And she's amazing. She's everyone should check out Sister Rosetta. And all you have to do is get on YouTube, look up some things, look up This Train, look up Rock Me, all of the, a lot of really great songs. And I just feel very frustrated that people have limited their rock and roll diet to more recent stuff and not looking back at the past that influenced Led Zeppelin, that influenced Elvis, that influenced all these things to create the music that we listen to today.
Awesome recommendation.
Thank you.
So I have more of a technique or practice that I wanted to recommend. I was telling you before the start of the podcast, I have had an extremely difficult week. Extremely. Work has just been insane. I hate working for government. It's just, systems are evil. So there's that. So in order to help me kind of get through this week, and I haven't been as on my self-care practices, but these are self-care practices that I use to help keep me grounded so that I am not all over the place, and just kind of wanted to offer up a few of them to our Mennonite community who's listening to this podcast. One of them actually is a playlist. So I've been compiling songs that I want to put together for a playlist that are more affirmation based, that encourage me rather than bring me down. And so I have been listening this week. One of my favorite songs, actually, and the version by it is by David Crowder Band, is How He Loves. I just love that song. Every time I listen to that song, the way he does it, I just end up crying and end up turning into a weepy ball of mess. But I also like Black Gold by Esperanza Spalding, and I Will Rise Up by Adedayo. I Am Light by India Irie. Beautiful by Mali Music. So Three Little Birds by Bob Marley. Like, these songs that affirm me, not just as a child of God, but as a Black woman, which is really, really important for my well-being and self-care, and healing, resiliency. A couple other practices that I've been using. I end up writing. Well, I do write. I am a writer. And before this year, I used to write a whole lot of just prose and essays and thought pieces. This year, I've been spending way more time reflecting and just thinking about my thoughts, setting my intention for the day, just trying to be more present about what's going on instead of responding to everything that's going on out here, which is a lot. It's a lot going out in the world, but also trying to think about what's going on inside and slowing down long enough and more often enough to just get out what I'm going through. The other self-care practice that I've been utilizing is this deep breathing and taking the breath, taking the pause, just a simple inhale and exhale to give my body more oxygen and help me be more grounded. So I wanted to offer up those resources because they are helping me. And I realize that when I tap into them, that I am definitely more grounded. Another one I did yesterday, I was working from home because my son has been sick all week, is taking a dance break to get movement and my blood flowing. And I tell you, after I took about 10 minutes to dance, I came back into my work just I felt more energy. I was more positive. I felt like I had just a brand new lens on what I needed to do. In spite of my situation not changing externally, internally, I was able to show up better. So I wanted to offer those.
Hey, that's actually interesting that you mentioned about self-care, because this week, what I do for self-care, the number one thing that I do for self-care is on occasion, once or twice a year, it should probably be more, that is I take a silent retreat. I'll actually go to a Trappist monastery, which is a silent monastery, and they have these guest houses, and you can go there and take a silent retreat. And I'll usually take like a 3-day retreat. And that's difficult to do for you in your circumstance. And when I had little kids, I couldn't do that either. But as your kids get older and they become more independent, I actually recommend that to you to think about it anyway. Just to get a break, get away from kids and husband and job, and take a few days and just spend time with the Lord and allow the Lord time to speak into your life.
Amen.
It's awesome. It's so good.
Amen. Something to aspire to.
Yes. Someday.
One day. My kids are young, so I got a long way to go.
Oh, it's not that long, really. I know it's hard, but it's there. It's there. It'll happen. Right. All right. Okay.
So the meat of our discussion, as I said, we are going to be talking about housing today. And there is so much that we could cover. We could talk for a long, long time. We could write books and essays about housing, because as you and I both know, and I hope that our audience is well aware of, that we are in the midst of a housing crisis. And so I'm hoping that we can start off by talking a little bit about what that crisis looks like from our vantage point in each of our communities.
Yeah. So okay. I mean, in fact, actually, in Portland, that last October, they talked about, or the city announced that we are in a housing emergency, and they're seeking federal funds for the housing emergency and things like that. But and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. But in your community, what does that look like?
So in Minneapolis, and not just Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, I don't think we're at that emergency. Well, it feels like an emergency. I don't think anybody has announced that from a leadership level. There's so many different housing things that are going on here, not just across the board, but specifically for people of color as well. One of the things that is happening is that we are getting way more investment in the Twin Cities region by way of businesses, by way of light rail transit systems and other things like greenways and bikeways and things of that nature. Way more economic development, businesses wanting to move and relocate here. There's just a lot of investment coming into our cities. One thing that has happened is, as a result of that, many communities, many people who have lived in places that were once undesirable, like in the inner city, have been and are being displaced and moved out to suburban areas or other areas, as investment agencies and people who have higher means of wealth are coming in and buying up homes and properties. Some of our public housing units are being switched over to market rate units. There have been 2-3 units that have closed over the last 2 years that I know about, and there are probably more right in our inner core that used to have lower to middle income families living in there, and they've been switched over to market rate. There's another public housing unit they've been fighting very, very furiously. It's actually right next to my daughter's school, that is at risk of also being changed over to market rate, which ends up really displacing families. Even if they keep the housing less the market rate, say that it's still subsidized, some landlords and some property owners are raising rents as high as they can to still be under that subsidized umbrella, but it ends up pricing families out nonetheless, because those are rates that they cannot afford. And so that's one that's happening that's been really, really tragic, because so many families, and it's affecting families of color the most, are being displaced from their communities. They're being moved out to outer ring suburbs that don't always have the access to transportation and to education, to jobs, things of that nature, because all of the development is happening right in the central cities and not as much on the inner and outer ring suburbs. And so it's been a real shame, actually, and a real tragedy as well. So that's one of the things that are happening. Obviously, they're not building affordable housing at the rate that they need to. And so as units are being converted, families are still not being able to afford rent. They end up paying more than 30% of their income on paying for housing, which makes families unstable. Like, that's really kind of like and it's still 30% still seems too high. But if families are paying more than that, all it takes is one single crisis or incident to displace families and get them either evicted, kicked out, or help them or make them fall behind on their rent. The other housing issue is that, and I'm not as up to date on this because I have switched jobs in the last 10 months, the job that I used to work at, there is this big debate in our region about segregation versus integration. The person who's leading that debate is a white college-educated lawyer who has access to means and things of that nature, is saying that concentrating families of color in the inner core is racist and is exasperating poverty, and some other rhetoric that he's using. He's actually suing the city of Minneapolis. I believe he might be suing St. Paul as well. I know for sure Minneapolis, because he sees that these cities are producing racially concentrated areas of poverty, not realizing that the city actually has concentrated areas of wealth. He's not talking about those areas where wealth is actually concentrated by people who are white. He's really just targeting those communities that are lower income, that are populated by people of color, and problematizing those communities and saying that they need to be more integrated. If a community has more than 20% people of color, then it's not integrated. Like, it's really bad rhetoric, and it's being led by someone who doesn't have connections to communities, who is not speaking from that vantage point of that community, and actually refuses to hear community as well. And so I think all those layers, when you get the development piece, when you get this lawsuit, when you get people being displaced and the apartments being sold off and now becoming market rate, you just have a really nasty housing picture. I probably went on too long.
But I have a question. Okay, so this guy is saying that he's suing the city because they have areas of the city that have more than 20% concentration of people of color.
Yeah.
Well, I don't. First of all, I don't see how he has the right to sue the city. Not even a person of color. I don't get that.
Yeah, right.
I mean, he's not being oppressed. Is he being oppressed as a white person because there's too many black people in one area? I don't even understand this.
So his vantage point is that because people of color are not living in racially concentrated areas, well, because they're living in racially concentrated areas of poverty, that's the terminology, is really disgusting. Because they're living in those areas, they are not having the access to opportunity that white people have. So he's saying that if they lived in areas that had more wealth and income, they would have access to better schools, they would have access to all these other opportunities. But because you're locating them in the inner core where there a lack of resources, which is not true, because our communities are abundant with resources, that they are being discriminated against.
And doesn't he understand too that when there's a concentration of people of color, that means that there's also a concentration of a particular culture? And so if you try to break down the communities, the concentrated communities of color, then you're also breaking down the opportunities for people to develop that culture in a way that they are comfortable in and of themselves. I don't understand where this guy is coming from and how he has the right to sue the cities for this. I just don't get this.
Those are all the questions that we ask. All of them. You've hit every single one. You're probably missing some of them. But
I'm sure I am.
It's weird.
Sure. No, here's another question that I have. How, if this guy succeeds in his suit, how is he making money out of it?
That's the long-term question. That's the question in the back of my mind. I'm like, why do you care? Because this is not your community. Like, what's in it for you? What's the motivation? Are you motivated by, there's so many questions that I have. And that's the big one. I'm like, so I'm concerned. I'm glad that you care about us. I'm concerned that you don't actually take your leadership from us and are speaking for us in ways that are really problematic. I could go on and on about that case in and of itself because it's a lot. And but I want to really give you an opportunity to talk about what's going on in Portland with housing.
Okay, all right. I'm just mystified by this. Okay, could you send me an article? I'm really curious about it.
I actually have several. I will. I'm not going to say his name on the air.
No, that's fine. But instead of sending it to me, let's go ahead and put it in the notes on the thing. So send it to Ryan, and he'll put it in the notes, and then I'll read it because this is just mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
Okay. in Portland, it's similar to how you're doing it, except instead of like initiating from green spaces and all that, I'd say that the problem with Portland really began with Portlandia, the TV show.
Okay.
The TV show came up, and it's all, the whole TV show is about making fun of Portland and all of that. And I just want to let you know that half the things in the TV show are true. Okay. Like this. I mean, these guys go around Portland and investigate different things. There's one of the skits about the feminist bookstore. It's down the street from me. I've been over there, but Portland, all of us, a lot of times we don't like it because it's making fun of things that we really like.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that other people say that and say, "Oh, Portland is like such and such," and so we want to go and move there. And since 2010, our growth has increased 20%.
Wow.
People moving in to Portland has increased 20%, and all of these people are of a higher income bracket than the people who originally lived here. Well, because of this, Portland understands that we are heading toward an amazing boom where money is going to be pouring into the city. And so this means that, but there's not enough housing. We've had a housing crisis, and so we don't have enough housing for all the people moving in. So what's going on is that landlords are increasing the rent to tremendous things. In fact, in one of the cities, even the suburban areas, in the city of Gresham, which is right next to Portland, there are apartment buildings in which they give every single person in the apartment building $1,000 rent increase 30 days. So next month, your rent is going to be increased $1,000.
Wow.
That is not uncommon. That we're finding apartments all over the city where their rents are going up 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, and even more. All the apartment buildings are doing this. And the reason is because they know that if they get rid of that they have that can't afford the higher prices, they can rent to people coming in who can afford higher rents. This means that we've got people who are just out on the street. So for instance, I have a friend of mine, her name's Jessica, and she ended up having this situation, and she gave me a call and said, "Well, I'm gonna get another place, but it's not ready yet. Can you please help me to be homeless for a week so that way I can live on the street for a week or maybe 2 weeks before we move into our next apartment that we can afford." But the thing is that there's a lot of people who can't find any place that they can afford because the rents are going up so staggeringly high. In fact, rents have gone up 15% in the last year and a half. They've gone up 50%, and almost all of that is at the very low end, the low income end of the apartments, the low income apartments. Anyway, and so, but they're going up have gone up 15% in the last year. The thing is that so we have people not just having to be homeless for a short period of time, but we have masses of people who are moving into RVs, but then they have no place to put the RV once they do, because all the RV parks are full. And in fact, if you have an RV that is more than 10 years old, the RV parks will not accept them. They won't let them in. And so you have to, so a lot of people are taking RVs and then they're moving onto the street. But it's not legal to park an RV anywhere in the city. So that means that there's now a group, and all they do is they tow RVs. There's a place, and I pass by it every a couple times a week, and it is just a huge parking lot, and it's just full of these used RVs that have been towed. And then they turn around and they sell these RVs to other families who are being kicked out of their apartments, so that way they take that RV, move it onto the street, and it ends up being towed again. Yeah, that's the situation. That's our situation, which is why the mayor last year called a housing crisis. But it's not just that. I mean, we also have the increased homeless population, which is getting insanely out of control. And not only is there not low-income apartments being built, but there are no new homeless beds that are being opened up for almost the last year. So even though homelessness is increasing, the amount of possibility of people being able to get off the street is decreasing.
Right.
Anyway, so isn't that fun?
No.
Don't you want to live here?
I feel like many of the issues are so similar.
Yeah, no, they really are.
And you were talking about the investment that was happening. I feel like a lot of this is being driven by money and profit, right? Because I don't actually think that we have a housing problem in America. What we have is a hospitality problem. There are so many vacant homes. There are so much land. There's so much of everything. We actually have an abundance of things, or an overabundance of things, because Americans are kind of greedy, y'all. So it's not because we actually lack the infrastructure. We actually lack the will to do what is right for those who do not have the resources, those who cannot, who are just making a few dollars an hour. There was a report that I was talking to you about before we got on the air, from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. That it's a report called Out of Reach, and they do a report every single year about how many hours people need to work in every state in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at market rate. In Minnesota, just to read you a couple of state facts, our minimum wage is $9.50 an hour. Our average renter wage, so what most people make an hour, is about $14.28. What it costs to rent a 2-bedroom apartment at market rate that is decent is $18.60, $18 an hour and 60 cents. For people who are working at minimum wage of $9.50 an hour, they need to work 62 hours a week to afford not a 2-bedroom, but a 1-bedroom. If you go, and as I said, it's the National Low Income Housing Coalition. The report is Out of Reach. If you go on this website, it will break it down state by state what the housing situation looks like at a glance at a state level, which helps us to understand the broadness and the deepness of this issue.
Hey, I want to let you know, though, in Portland, the good news is that we have just instituted a new minimum wage. So our minimum wage right now is at $11.25. But the problem is that according to that same report, in Oregon, if you want to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, you're going to have to make $19.46 an hour instead of $11.25. So we're still far from people being able to afford apartments.
Right.
Oh,
right.
Here's another thing, though. In case you wanted to move into my neighborhood, the neighborhood where we're at right now, just 1 block away, there is a condo, and it was just built a year ago, something like that, a year and a half ago, something like that, and they are selling condos there for $1.5 million for less than 2,000 feet.
Wow.
It's $1.5 million. So heck, you want to move into my neighborhood? Just all you need is a couple $1 million, and you're good to go.
Right. Oh my gosh. Um, Steve, we're both theologians, we're both pastors. Why does this matter?
Well, it matters, first of all, because, like you said, the reason for this is greed. And Jesus had a few things to say about greed.
This is true.
He had a few things to say about people taking land that belongs to God, and then increasing the prices so that way people who are of low income, who are poor, cannot live on the land, and then blocking the land so that way people can't even have any place to live, whether in an RV or whether in a tent. Uh, God's people are the poor, and God watches over the poor. And honestly, I'll tell you the truth. The thing that I'm most concerned about is God's judgment on this land, because they are oppressing the poor simply because they want more money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you know, when that happens, I don't know if you are familiar with Psalm 82, where God is talking to all the leaders of all the world and telling them, you need to take care of the poor. You need to watch yourself and make sure that the poor are taken care of. And it says in the psalm that the leaders of the world don't pay any attention. They don't listen to God. They're not listening to what he does. And so he says, either you're going to do this or I am going to judge you. And this is what I'm really concerned about. Honestly, I love Portland. I moved to Portland, decades ago, because I love this city. And I don't want to see it be judged. I don't want to see the people here be condemned because they're just so dang greedy. And it's not everybody. It's really a handful of people who are in charge of a certain amount of land.
Absolutely. And I just want to piggyback off of one of the things you talked about, just to talk about the depravity of this issue. You talked about the land really being God's land. And in America, God bestowed the land originally to American Indians.
Yeah.
We know that the land was stolen away from American Indian tribes. And do you know who has the highest homeless rate in our country?
I bet you it's American Indians.
It's American Indians for sure. And a lot of times, because of racism, because of the way data is done and conducted, American Indians don't show up in all of the reports that our foundations and organizations and other projects pump money into. But the disparity, the greatest amount of unemployment, of housing insecurity, and so many of our other disparities are done against this land's original owners, which I think really speaks to how depraved and how ungodly our nation's leaders are. So you were talking about the judgment that happens when we don't follow God's commands. Is it just because we're fearing judgment that we should be cautious, or what are some other reasons that we as pastors and theologians and congregation members and lay leaders and all these other ways in which we show up in communities of faith, why else should we care about what is happening?
Well, I think that primarily our main concern should be to be like Jesus, to act like Jesus, to live lives that reflect. Jesus saw people who are in their greatest needs, and he reached out to help them in that point. It's actually, and I think actually, in Jesus' day, the most severe issue was issues of health, issues of mental health, and other things like that. And so Jesus said, okay, this is what I'm especially targeting. I think in our culture, the main issue is housing. The main issue is just giving people a secure place to live, where they're not being pushed around and oppressed because of that. It's interesting that we've got really cool church. It's a Methodist congregation, and they found that they just didn't quite have enough people to keep the doors of their church open. And so what they're doing instead is they're going ahead and they're closing the congregation down, but they still have enough money to be able to do something. So they are leveling their church and they are building low-income housing on their things. And this is all supported by the denomination, and it's going to end up being run by the denomination and by the congregation that's left. And this model is being looked at by many different churches in our community, and people are looking and saying, "Hey, well, we have this extra property which isn't being used, and we don't see a church being able to use it. Maybe we should, instead of just selling it and taking the money, maybe we should develop low-income housing." And this is something that's happening more and more in our things, and I think that that's living like Jesus. That is taking the resources that we have and turning it into actual living spaces for people who are low income, people who are poor, to be able to live.
Absolutely. Two things I wanted to share. So I'll start with one thing that our church is doing, and then I wanted to address the health component that you talked about, and comparing our day to Jesus's day, really briefly. One thing that our church is doing, as I mentioned, and my pastor says this all the time, and I think he said it a lot more when I first started going to our church about 4 years ago. America doesn't have a housing problem, it has a hospitality problem. Because we know that there are churches, there are buildings, there are more empty rooms and houses, there are vacant homes, there's so much that we have, and it's only because of greed that people are not having a safe, secure place to just to be and do family and life with. One thing that I really appreciate about my church is that it does a community housing model where people live together. And so I see a lot of single people using this model, but I've seen some families use it, and I would like to use it as well. And to be able to take people into our into our home. So that, the reason I mentioned this model is because I think what ends up happening is we redefine our definition of community and what community is, what family is, what homelessness is. Instead of a bunch of single adults or families owning or having apartments, each family having their own individual apartment, or each single person having their own individual apartment and having to pay $1,600 a month for rent. If we didn't buy the home that we lived in, we would have had to pay $1,600 a month for rent, which is one of the reasons why we were compelled to buy, not because we felt necessarily ready for it, but because we knew it was just impractical to spend that much money on something that we did not own. It would have made us very housing insecure if we hadn't done that. So we decided to take a leap of faith the other way. But to redefine our standard of family, of community by living together, we end up not using all of these resources, spending all of these resources to pay for a housing situation that some of us just can't afford. It's not sustainable the way that rents keep rising, and people just don't have the resources to be able to maintain that standard of living. As we talked about in the report, people have to work 78, 60 hours, an exorbitant amount of hours just to make ends meet, which means that they're not spending time with their families, which means that they're not cooking healthy meals, which means that sometimes they're just struggling to decide, do I put food on the table? Do I pay for transportation so I can get to work? All these different things end up competing for families' priorities when people are paying more for rent or a mortgage than they should. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that you talked about in Jesus's day, he was addressing primarily health related outcomes, and housing may not necessarily be a health related outcome, but actually it is. There's a lot of evidence and research from all over the place. You could start with the Robert G. Wood Foundation or Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for a starting place, but that has information on the social determinants of health. One of those determinants of health is housing. Education, employment, transportation, social networks, social cohesion, those are all determinants of health. But when you do not have a safe place to live, when your housing is infected with mold and dust, when your housing is being compromised because of weather and climate change, all those things make for a very stressful environment, which compromises people's health. And so our housing crisis is actually a public health crisis. And so we can't think about it in isolation as housing is over here, health is over here, education is over here, employment is over here. All these things actually coalesce, and the absence of one thing makes for a very delicate family situation, a very delicate community situation. Communities that are fragmented because of housing are actually doing poorer. And so it deeply affects us at a health level as well.
And in fact, actually, just to build onto that, if you look at people in the most severe housing crisis, so people who are chronically homeless, the average life expectancy for a person who's chronically homeless is 48. Wow. As opposed to the average life expectancy, which is about 77.
Yeah.
And so that is a huge difference. One other model I just wanted to bring up, and I'm not sure if I interrupted you. Did I interrupt you?
Just a bit.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
No, I don't remember what I was saying. Go ahead.
No. Okay. See, that's what I get for interrupting you. One other model that I wanted to bring up is besides building low-income housing and living together in community, is my family took as a basic model Jesus' statement, "I was a stranger and you invited me in." And so for the last 25 years, we've been taking people who had no other housing and we invited them into our house. Sometimes families, sometimes single people, sometimes people who have been living on the street for decades, and sometimes people who have just gotten on the street. We've taken a lot of people. In our house, we've had as many as 16 people living here at a time.
Wow.
Don't necessarily recommend that. But it worked. We worked it out. But what I want to say though is basically the model that Jesus proposed is: you see someone who is in need of housing, if you've got any extra room, take them in. That doesn't mean that we should take anybody in, but it means that we should keep our eyes open and see and look at situations in which maybe we should have some people in for even if it's just for a few days. That can really be instrumental for somebody's life.
Absolutely. Steve, this has been a wonderful conversation. We could keep going. There's so many questions I have. I'm sure you have so many questions, but I am going to draw our time to a close. So, because it's Friday and it's 10:44 p.m. and I had a rough week.
It's only 8:44 here, so I could go on. And I had a nap, so I'm good.
Well, I'm going to close us, and if you feel like you want to go on without me, feel free.
Oh, it's not as much fun.
Thank you for this rich conversation, and thank you to our podcast audience for listening. A special shout out to Ryan Robinson for all of his amazing editing skills. I know he's going to clean up all of our flaws and bloopers this evening. I also want to offer the Mennonite community, if you have any questions, and I hope you have questions, our audience, our people have been really, really silent. And so we crave your interaction. If you have any questions or statements or comments or concerns, or you just want to say, hey, please direct your comments, your concerns, your hays to BGWG@MennoNerds.com. That's all I have. Have a wonderful, blessed evening or day if you're listening to this podcast during the day. Just have a blessed, amazing life. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at MennoNerds.com. It's the hub for all things MennoNerds. From there, you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now, there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out MennoNerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.